Her shadow lingered, though life had left her. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallo. I'd love to know, where are you listening from today? Your words make this journey special. Time to begin. The evening had settled like old vellum upon the stones, a soft grain to the light that made even the ivy appear scholarly. I had walked the perimeter of St. Margaret's with no intention other than to feel the day loosen its grip. There are hours in Oxford when the air smells of paper and damp wool. In the second quadrangle, a drizzle began, fine as breath. The lamps woke in their cages and cast halos on the paving. I was thinking of a crossword clue that had irked me all afternoon, Dawn's counterfeit 7 letters, when I saw the shadow. It slipped over the flagstones from left to right, narrow at first, then widening as if hips and a shoulder bag, and there was a brief tilting of the head as if toward a remembered window. I looked for the body that must father its shade. I am not a superstitious man, irritable, yes, credulous, no. I told myself that the lamps were misaligned, that the rain made mirrors of the stones, that a late cyclist beyond the archway had thrown his outline like a conjurer's scarf. I told myself many reasonable things and did not believe a single one of them. Lewis would have asked if I'd been to the pub, and I would have said that one whiskey taken with the reluctance of a patient toward medicine does not produce apparitions. In truth, I had taken 2, and they had not helped. The day had been taken up with paperwork, always the most persuasive argument for drink, and with a call from Strange, interrupting a Mahler adagio to tell me nothing I wanted to know. He spoke of budget and visibility, of the proper use of one's hours. I said that hours are. Rain ran along the guttering. Footsteps approached, stopped, resumed. The college has a staccato way of moving after dark. I walked to the spot where the shadow had climbed. The stone there held a paler dryness, a footprint of absence. My eyes travelled up the wall to the mullioned window of the old library. A lamp glowed within, buttery and municipal. No movement. Shadows misbehave in Oxford. They do not cling to their owners as in newer cities. They are tutored by cloisters and misled by archways. I have followed more than one shadow to a conclusion its maker could never have predicated. Even so, I felt the minor humiliation of having been startled by what might have been an optical pun. I told myself to go home. Instead, I went to the lodge and asked the porter whether anyone had passed by in the last minute. He said that only Dr. Cross had returned earlier with a stack of papers and a damp expression. He asked, in the tone used for eccentrics and convalescents, whether all was well. I said that all was adequately arranged for a Tuesday. Walking back, I paused at the notice board. A lecture on Milton's Shadows of Sense, postponed. A recital of Purcell's songs, sold out. There was also a duplicate of the week's crossword, pinned with an absent-minded cruelty that made me smile. Dawn's counterfeit, false light. A tidy answer, yet the letters insisted upon Aurora's sham, and my mind unhelpfully supplied a life lived under lamplight posing as day. The quadrangle had darkened by degrees. Rain and stone made their quiet pact. I stood where I had first seen her, insofar as one can see a person, in the grammar of absence, and felt the old ache of wanting to know and not to know. The lamps hummed softly. I thought of the head that had tilted, the window that had not moved, the footprint that was not a print. I told myself again to go home. I watched the stones as if they might answer me. They kept their counsel, as always, tonight. Lewis arrived before the kettle found its voice. He hovered in the doorway with that conscientious awkwardness he keeps for sorrow and for me, and said there was something I ought to see. He placed a clipping on my desk as though transferring a fragile moth. The headline behaved. The paragraph hid behind a phrase I have distrusted all my working life. An apparent suicide in Jericho. The name, neat enough for college stationery, was Anna Frobisher. I read it once while the kettle offered a thin apology to the room. I read it again after the gas fell quiet. That small adverb clung to the verb like a timid chaperone. Apparently, we would rather not say, "Please do not ask us to know." We walked to Jericho beneath the democratic rain Oxford reserves for minor tragedies. Pavements shone like patient silver. Bicycles shrugged past with the cheerful indifference of the blameless. At the crossroads, a stack of the same story wicked water into its edges. Newsprint grows solemn when wet, as if grief could be absorbed by capillary action. Her building crouched over a bakery whose bread names demanded more Latin than most degrees. A young constable arranged his face into sturdiness and let us pass. The flat was small enough to remember its inhabitants. A mug cooled on the draining board, leaving a pale ellipse of heat on the saucer. Someone had silenced the radio. A leaflet for Purcell's songs lay splayed beside it like a fan that closed a blink too late. The body had already gone to that chilled kingdom where facts pretend to suffice. What remained were the small insistencies. On the bedside table lay an empty bottle whose label had been peeled from the middle, not the edge. People who peel from the middle are impatient or anxious, or both. On the desk, a half sheet began with a name scored out until ink became bruise. The lines that followed ambled toward confession and abandoned courage at the margin, as if language itself had pulled the door almost shut. I sat at the desk, the sort of chair that outlives better rooms, and looked toward the window. The street performed its ordinary theatre, umbrellas, an idling van, the bakery's steam rehearsing the same small miracle. The lamplight, in the glass, recalled last night's quadrangle and the long figure that crossed it without consequence. Minds like their rhymes, even the disreputable ones. False light, I thought, and yesterday's crossword lifted its answer as though claiming authorship of my unease. Lewis, who knows more of me than I deserve, found a folded crossword beneath a paperweight stamped with the college crest. He said that vices travel and placed it where my hand might accidentally fall upon it. I permitted the accident. Several clues had been filled in a stout, tidy hand. 3 bore a different gait, the R's looped too generously, the S's flattened by a schoolteacher's thrift. 2 minds at one grid, or 1 mind with company. 7 down asked again for Dawn's counterfeit. Someone had written false light with a sureness not found elsewhere on the page, as if that answer belonged to the room before the rest of the puzzle did. The neighbour spoke to us in the passage, a woman with flour to her wrists and a voice educated by early mornings. Miss Frobisher kept hours like a lighthouse, she said. The lamp in the front room outlasted weather and visitors. On Sunday, a tall woman in a wine-dark coat climbed the stairs, not hurrying, not dawdling. The voice from above, the neighbour remembered, carried the confidence of those who have been listened to too long. Hair uncertain, shoes decisive on wood. She smiled when she said decisive, as if the sound had survived in the banister. Lewis suggested the comfortable reading. I answered that comfort is a poor detective. He looked at the empty bottle and said the story would not thank us for improving it. The label, I said, was torn from the centre. People who tidy their despair usually work from the corner. He allowed that some griefs are clumsy. I told him clumsiness has its patterns too. Back at the station I made a small cathedral of damp newspapers around the clipping. St. Margaret's again. The city is a carousel, and one grows dizzy at the old faces. I rang the lodge. The porter, disobliging in the collegiate way that wishes to seem helpful, confirmed that Dr. Helena Cross had been in early and out later, and that she would once more like the stair lighting repaired. He asked, in the tone reserved for men who haunt libraries, whether everything was quite all right. I told him that light has its habits, and that some are less innocent than they appear. I read the piece a 3rd time. Found late, a light still burning. It is simple to set a lamp to masquerade as presence. Rooms can be taught to hold their breath. Borrowed light, I thought again, and felt the quadrangle return, and the shadow that crossed it after the hour in which it should not have. We would go to St. Margaret's in the morning and ask the usual impertinences in our usual polite way. For the moment, I let the rain have the windows, and allowed the word apparently to sit where it liked, knowing it would not stay long. Oxford wears grief in its own peculiar costume. Black gowns are never entirely absent, and silence clings naturally to cloisters, so that mourning becomes less an interruption than a modulation, a semitone lower in a piece already grave. When Lewis and I entered St. Margaret's that morning, the air itself seemed rehearsed for loss. The porter gave us a look half clerical, half curious, as though assessing whether sorrow had the proper credentials. He directed us across the quadrangle, where rain left its grey annotations on stone. The flagstones remembered centuries of scholars with little interest in which particular student had just joined the dead. The warden received us in a panelled room where dust preferred the high shelves, and the fire performed its duty with academic restraint. He spoke in the measured cadence of one who has practiced condolences as part of the job description. Miss Frobisher had been a promising girl, unfortunate circumstances, her withdrawal from the college regretted by all. The words fell into position like Latin verbs, correctly conjugated yet without blood. Lewis asked the practical questions. When had she last been in contact? Had she kept friends within the walls? Had her departure been voluntary? The warden replied as one who had rehearsed a play too often. 2 years ago, yes, a few acquaintances, and of course voluntary. His hands never strayed from the arms of his chair, as though he feared the tremor of elaboration. The bursar entered, trim as an accountant of souls, and remarked that Anna had never caused financial inconvenience. It was, he added, a relief that her rooms had been reassigned without delay at the time. There was in his voice the faint satisfaction of accounts balanced, sorrow itemized and filed. We met 2 dons in succession. One spoke warmly of her brilliance in Latin elegiacs, and another of her spirited contributions to seminars on Milton. Yet when I asked why she had left so abruptly, both employed that same evasive pronoun, circumstances, as though the word itself contained clauses too delicate to unfold. I watched the flick of their eyes toward the warden, who seemed to conduct the conversation without lifting a baton. It was during tea, overpoured by a secretary who had learned discretion as etiquette, that Dr. Helena Cross, Anna's former tutor, spoke in tones more severe. Anna had talent, but lacked the discipline to harness it. Some students mistook imagination for industry. She paused, then added with something between bitterness and weariness, she disappeared. Like a shadow at dawn, Hardy said that. I made no correction. To argue literature in a room heavy with stale mourning would have been impolite. But the line troubled me, for I recalled Hardy differently. His shadow did not vanish with the morning, but lingered beyond the body, a defiance of order, not an erasure. Misquotation is rarely innocent. It tells you what the speaker wishes were true. Lewis shifted in his chair, restless among abstractions. He preferred motives to metaphors, evidence to epigrams, but I tucked the error away as carefully as a coin placed in a drawer. One day the sound of it would return, demanding recognition. We left the college through corridors that smelt of paper grown faintly foxed, of chalk ground into carpets, of rain attempting entry through leaded panes. The undergraduates we passed stepped aside with exaggerated politeness, as though death had conferred upon us a temporary authority. I envied them their ignorance. They would hurry to lectures, to love affairs, to examinations, while one of their own lay on a slab where silence no longer measured itself in essays. Outside, Lewis said the dons had been polite enough. I answered that politeness can be a form of obstruction. He asked whether I believed them. I said I believed in what they avoided, and in the weight of a single misquoted poet. The bells from a nearby chapel began their rehearsal for evening. The sound was neither consoling nor cruel, only inevitable. I thought of the quadrangle the night before last, of the shadow that had crossed when it should not have, and of words spoken in error that sometimes contain more of the truth than their correction. Colleges prefer their scandals spoken softly, like psalms after evensong. In the senior common room the fire muttered, Curtains held a ceremonial starch, and portraits gazed at a future none of us would see. Lewis introduced us with the patience of a librarian at closing time. 4 waited: Dr. Helena Cross, starched into severity; Edward Latimer, raffish and threadbare; Clara Denning, careful as a borrowed book; Reverend Michael Brooke, charming in the professional way clergy carry like a polished key. Cross began in the tone reserved for undergraduates who misuse the vocative. Anna was quick, she said, brilliant in the unsettling way bright weather quickens a river. Quickness without discipline is a match struck in an attic. The line felt prepared. "Why did Anna leave?" I asked. "Certain departures are proper," Cross said, and the warden would confirm. Her hands lay parallel on the chair arms, a geometry against trembling. Latimer refused a chair, chose the piano stool, and turned half away as if ready to accompany our questions. Anna could ransack an argument and return it improved, he told us. Rumours of closeness were the faculty's revenge on vitality. He had not seen her, though a letter had arrived last month. He could not produce it. He smiled like a man who thinks candour substitutes for proof. Clara stayed by the hearth and warmed her answers before offering them. Anna loved the smell of the paper store, she said, then corrected herself. She avoided it for loving it too much. I asked about the Sunday visitor in the wine-dark coat. Her eyes went to Cross with the reflex of a pupil toward a bell. "Someone from the chapel," she said, and looked at Brooke with a gentleness nearer apology than trust. Brooke poured sympathy as port is poured, from a modest height to make a little air. He had counselled Anna after a disappointment he would not name. She replied with courtesy rather than faith, which, he observed, is often the better beginning. "What disappointment?" I asked. "The confessional is not a filing cabinet," he answered, then added, too easily, that disappointed love is the only classic most students read thoroughly. His gaze settled on Clara with pastoral neutrality. A steward set down a bottle and left it by the silver. Cross declined as if abstinence had been timetabled. Brooke asked for a modest measure. Latimer accepted with the gratitude of a man whose alibi might arrive corked. Clara touched the stem and returned her fingers to their folded sanctuary. I watched the meniscus climb and thought of evenings when I had appointed wine to keep me company. It absolves clumsily and remembers everything. Contradictions gathered like condensation. Cross praised discipline, yet allowed the plural of Anna's friendships to hover unexplained. Latimer denied intimacy using the grammar of the intimate. Clara answered small questions with a choreography of glances that sought permission from the very person she feared. Brooke hid behind sacrament and then wandered into epigram. I remembered the crossword in Anna's flat, 2 hands at the grid, one surer than the other. The doubleness persisted. Lewis asked to see the lodge record of vehicles visiting on Sunday evening. The porter's book would hold its tedious gospel of plates and times. I wondered whether a registration ending in LYT might recur. The idea came not from evidence, but from letters arranging themselves into sermons. Light again, false or borrowed. Cases choose their metaphors early and resent exchange. We rose. Cross requested economy in our inquiries. Grief, she said, improves when handled with brevity. Latimer tipped his head toward the piano as if promising an elegy and disdaining the dead in the same gesture. Clara asked whether the funeral would be private, and remembering she was not family, examined her shoes. Brooke murmured the college would keep Anna in its prayers, a phrase that suggests a cupboard where names are stored until useful. We stepped into the quadrangle. Rain began with novice meekness. Behind us the bottle breathed. Chairs remained angled away from truth. Loneliness has many tutors. Wine is only the most punctual. I told Lewis our next conversation belonged to the porter and his register. The Stones listened and, with their old courtesy, told us nothing at all. Lewis found it almost apologetically, as though the act of opening drawers in the dead woman's flat still carried a trespass. He lifted the half-burned paper from a tin where the ashes of other pages lay like reluctant witnesses. The The fire had not finished its work. The edges curled inward, but the middle survived, a fragment that wanted both to speak and to disappear. We sat with it on the table between us. The handwriting faltered, leaning into itself as though the pen had lost faith in its own strokes. A voice emerged, shyly, almost tender, though bruised with hesitation. It began with an address never completed. Dearest, then scratched out until the word became a darkened scar. After that came a line too intimate to belong to friendship, too fearful to belong entirely to love. I cannot walk across the quad without feeling them watching. I cannot... It broke off. The ash had taken the rest, or perhaps the writer had stopped mid-thought, hearing the tread of steps on the stair. The page gave no name, no finality, only the grammar of interruption. Lewis said it was probably another fragment of despair, the sort of draft one writes when rehearsing solitude. He spoke carefully, like a man trying not to bruise the silence. I told him despair does not hesitate in such ways. When despair writes, it writes bluntly. This hand lingered, circled, recoiled. That is the shape of fear. We compared the writing to the crossword page I had pocketed. Not the same, but similar enough to suggest kinship. The same exaggerated loop in the R, the same tentative bend in the S. Two hands had once hovered over that puzzle, and one of them, I now thought, might have hovered over this confession that never arrived at its address. The question was to whom? Anna had left the college 2 years earlier, and yet her letter, born of secrecy, circled the very place she had abandoned. I cannot walk across the quad without feeling them watching. Why write of a quadrangle unless one had returned, at least in spirit, to the old stage? The porter had spoken of Dr. Cross, arriving late, asking for lights to be fixed. Latimer had hinted at letters but shown us none. Clara had looked too quickly at the chaplain when pressed about Sunday evenings. The shadow of the college hung over each of them, as though Anna's absence had never truly released them. Lewis asked whether I believed the letter genuine, or some draft from years past. I read it again, slowly, aloud to myself, but without voice, as if words could speak more clearly in silence. The hesitation in the pen told me it was recent. Paper ages differently when written upon in youth. This bore the tremor of someone grown older in disappointment. I folded it carefully, though one edge threatened to collapse into dust. I said to Lewis that shadows have weight. He raised an eyebrow in the way he reserves for my more cryptic remarks. I reminded him of the figure I had seen in the quadrangle, the outline without a body. Perhaps not Anna at all, but someone carrying her absence like a garment. Perhaps Clara, borrowing the cloak of memory. Or perhaps someone else altogether, using a shadow to suggest a presence that no longer breathed. The fire hissed in the grate of the station room where we worked. I placed the letter beside the clipping of her death. One said apparent, the other unfinished. Both refused completion. Lewis suggested a break, a pint to loosen thought. I declined. There are times when beer erases too much, and this letter demanded to be remembered in its partial state. I looked at the scarred word, dearest, again. The ink had thickened where the writer pressed too hard, as if trying to erase affection by doubling it. I thought of Hardy once more, of the line Helena Cross had misquoted, and the shadows that linger after their owners vanish. Anna's life, Anna's letter, Anna's shadow, each incomplete, each insisting more than they allowed. The letter was not sent, yet in its silence it travelled further than any delivery could have carried it. And for me, that evening, it travelled back across the quadrangle, where the lamps rehearsed their false light, and a shadow walked alone, reminding me that absence has its own grammar, and that I had not yet learned to read it. Latimer's guilt arrived like a neat theorem chalked before the bell and smudged by an impatient sleeve. His bitterness had architecture, his evasions a rhythm, his pockets the tired hollows of a man who has pawned more than cufflinks. When the diary surfaced, Lewis drawing it from a shoebox at the back of Anna's wardrobe, that shy theatre of intentions, I allowed myself the ease of a straight path. The paper kept the talc of recent purchase, the ink lay dark and shallow, as if the words had not yet made their peace with the page. His light, one line read, set apart as if it demanded a separate breath. Lewis liked the arithmetic. Latimer had hinted at letters and produced none. Uniform found a bank statement in his bin, withdrawals marching in tidy columns toward catastrophe. The porter's register offered his name late on Sunday. The porter recalled a brief quarrel about keys, then a silence that felt staged. Motive, means, opportunity began to hum their agreeable chorus. I carried the diary to the window. Jericho performed its parish rites, bicycles, bakery steam, a van proclaiming urgency by noise alone. The lamp in the room threw an oval on the wall, a skewed moon promising nothing. His light, wrote the diary. Yesterday's crossword returned as mild punishment. False dawns. The clue that waited had the setter's neat malice. Grecian original reflected in morning portico, 8. Then reflected showed its teeth. An instruction to rearrange morning portico, AM and STOA, sit them beside EOS, and you acquire brightness dressed as authority, a counterfeit sunrise. The exact answer mattered less than the trick of it. Light borrowed, paraded as possession. We went to Latimer. His rooms smelled of late academic hope, damp scores, a calendar arrested at a flattering month, a parade of bottles aligned like arguments awaiting indulgent company. He announced that he disliked being hunted and disliked more the suggestion that he was not worth the effort. We spoke of Anna with that grave fluency two men adopt when one has loved and the other has noticed. He denied intimacy using the grammar of a lover. When Lewis mentioned money, he smiled with the particular bravery of debt. He produced a receipt for a donation to the chapel fund, the sort of civic virtue men purchase when they cannot afford their own vices. Leaving, I almost bowed to the piano, which had accompanied nothing and understood everything. Back at the station, Lewis tied the ribbon with practiced fingers. Temper, need, opportunity, and now a line in Anna's diary. His light. I nearly agreed, but the ribbon scratched. His light sounded proprietorial in a way that owed little to affection and much to habit. Latimer owned a battered anglepoise and a floor standard that threw fatigue more than illumination. Nothing there could have persuaded a wall to mimic morning. The college, however, understands light. Stair bulbs kept with municipal zeal, library lamps with green hoods that make paper into stage, chapel sconces that teach shadows how to behave. A person cherished there might be called, without thinking, his light. Not a man at all, perhaps, a room, an institution, a ritual that impersonates tenderness after dark. Some truths prefer the glare, others live comfortably under borrowed lamps. Even the lodge book joined the chorus. Late Sunday, a small saloon entered, letters ending LYT, and left indecently soon. Light again, the alphabet determined to annotate the case. Lewis enjoyed the symmetry. He suggested providence. I distrust providence that arrives on time. Coincidence is the clerk who misfiles truths and smiles as he does it. I closed the diary and let the paper breathe beneath my palm. We would keep Latimer near, as one keeps a coat in unfriendly weather. Yet the crosswords lesson persisted. Reflected light warms no one, it persuades furniture to pretend it is day. The phrase in the diary, the oval on the wall, the letters in the porter's book. Together they suggested arrangement rather than ardor. I told Lewis we should revisit the places where light is administered by committee. He said that would be most of Oxford. The city would oblige us. I said, exactly. Libraries keep their secrets in the air as much as in the stacks. The smell was that familiar trinity of paper, dust, and old bindings, patient as a curate and just as watchful. I had come for the chapel ledger and stayed for the weather, which wrote itself faintly upon the mullions like a note left by a shy hand. A student coughed with the ceremony of the nearly silent. A librarian moved across carpet like a postponed thought. Milton waited on a high shelf, a handsome edition whose spine had learned dignity from neglect. I eased it free, and the binding made a small sound of disapproval. At a window seat I opened to a page that belonged less to the poet than to a caller who had come later. First, I saw the faint indentation photographs leave on text, then the thing itself, tucked with the care of someone who keeps tenderness in paper because there is nowhere else to hide it. Two women stood in a bright court, one half-turned, as though surprised, the other already pleased to be seen. Anna's face, finer than newsprint had permitted, tilted toward the lens with the complicity of the chosen. Clara rested her head against Anna's temple with the theatrical innocence of those who believe privacy and invisibility are synonyms. Arm in arm, not the brisk linking of comrades, but the careful entwining that knows exactly what it risks. Lewis, beside me, grew alert in that way he reserves for objects rather than poetry. "Friendship can be affectionate," he muttered into the hush, and I told him that arrangement declines in an irregular mood. He asked where and when. I let the photograph breathe on my palm. Its corners had begun to silver, that soft surrender by which images admit they are stories rather than proof. A small oval thumb smudge gleamed on the gloss, recent enough to suggest the picture had not slept for long. Behind them, a stained glass window confessed itself with unembarrassed particularity. Even dust becomes narrative when trapped in lead. I knew the window before its name returned, a medieval annunciation as improved by a Victorian donor, the lily painted with more yearning than botany, the angel a fraction overgrown, as if surplus grace had inflated him after the final brushstroke. On the sill beneath, always, a nick in the stone where a schoolboy, 70 years gone, had sharpened a pencil in the wrong place and been forgiven by time. Memory, that stubborn custodian, touched my sleeve. The place was the east corridor of the senior library. Lewis frowned at the angle, then shrugged, persuaded. But the date was the little hinge on which the larger door might turn. The women wore light coats, early or late term. Trees beyond the cloister kept their leaves, neither lush nor bare. The notice board behind them bore a garden party poster. A printer's tiny badge in the corner offered the year with bureaucratic modesty. By that reckoning, Anna was meant already to have gone. Photographs are loyal to the moment, not the narrative. Endings tolerate trespass when the light is kind. Clara had told us she left abruptly. The college rehearsed the line with practiced diction. Yet here were the two of them, still within walls, rehearsing a secrecy that outlives decision. Pictures lie honestly. They show everything and confess nothing of order. A touch can arrive after farewell and pretend to be prologue, provided the watcher colludes and the lamps remain steady. I turned the fly-leaf. A penciled note in a firm hand recorded a shelf move 2 summers prior. Initials H.C. stood with the stubborn neatness of a person who tidies other people's confusion. Cross had overseen that migration of books and would have handled this very copy. Had she seen the tucked image, and if she had, did she leave it where sorrow prefers to rest, near poetry that understands banishment? The graphite had been rubbed and retraced, a small palimpsest of librarian's remorse. Lewis asked whether the photograph proved anything. Proof is a word juries like, I told him. Detectives must be content with continuity. Here, continuity belonged to light. The same greenish hue from the corridor lamps, the same subaqueous glaze that turns young faces into fresco. I thought of the diary's ungenerous phrase, his light, and of chapel sconces that tutor shadows to behave. Borrowed light again, flattering transgression by making it look sanctioned. I slid the photograph back between pages, a courtesy to the dead and to those who would rather not be seen. We noted its birth, though exactness felt vulgar. Outside, the rain hesitated, the sky undecided between confession and postponement. I carried Milton to the desk with mock piety and felt the book release a sigh it had practiced for decades. We left with a window, a nick, and 2 faces pretending time could still be delayed. That night, remembering the corridor's greenish hush, I let the lamps burn longer than sense and watched my own shadow learn the college's old trick of looking almost alive. Clara chose the vestry, as if hymnals could civilize what she meant to say. Rain wrote slanted lines across the leaded panes. A lamp corrected the dusk without claiming authority. She stood rather than sit and said we were lovers, not a season or a dare. It was steady, careful, hidden, because hiding seemed the only way to keep it whole. She left since staying was harder to explain than leaving under Cross's weather. Anna, she said, had misplaced daylight and held books too softly to help herself. Depression, the word finally arrived, tidy and heavy as if issued by an office. Lewis kept the quiet he keeps for sorrow. I let my eyes inventory the room, the hymnboard's numbers like stairs that stop before the landing, a cupboard breathing metal and linen, a tide mark of damp learning the walls. Clara recited Sunday as if reading a ledger. The library, a walk, the phone unanswered, the chapel where she sat until the bell learned her shape. "Repeat it," I said. She did precisely, and precision thinned the air. I asked about the photograph in Milton. She did not deny. She called it a kindness for difficult days. The picture belonged to a past beyond warranty. Who watched Anna in the quadrangle? Expectations, she said. The college watches even when it looks away. The sentence had been pressed and ironed beforehand. Confession enlarges rooms. The lamp felt more deliberate, the rain official. I thought of the half-burned letter with its grammar of interruption. I thought of the diary's proprietorial light. Had anyone visited Anna recently? Latimer, she said, then worked too hard at neutrality. The chaplain, of course, and Cross, professionally. Of Cross, she spoke as if handling glass that remembers being a blade. We left her at the cloister. Rain improved into certainty. Lewis said the story kept shape. Shapes can be forged, I answered. What misfitted, he asked. Love seldom speaks in the past, perfect while the body is still warm. He pardoned the aphorism and proposed food. Crossing the arcade, I remembered the shadow that slid over the stones at an hour when the college had already drawn its curtains. Clara's account included chapel, walk, unanswered bell. Not a cloak. The figure I had seen suggested a hood, and the head turned toward a particular window to check attendance. Habit is a poor actor. It repeats under duress. If the shadow had been Clara, she performed a ritual she preferred not to confess. At the lodge, I borrowed the sign-out book and traced her name across weeks, regular entries, then a cluster of late returns, each annotated with modest excuses in clerkly hand. Twice she requested the east corridor lamps remain on beyond their bedtime. Once the note read, simply, light. The porter remembered the smile that accompanied it, a debt quietly paid. Back in my rooms I reconsidered her narrative. Love, depression, a decision taken in privacy. It fit too well. The Times had left me a clue, abandoned at breakfast. Attends sunrise falsely, 7. I tried auroral and was punished. What attends sunrise falsely is not the sky, but the city, the lamps that linger, the windows kept alive. I entered gaslit and disliked it, though the letters behaved. Borrowed light again, flattering what should have been night. Clara's sorrow may be entire. Yet somewhere a lamp had been maintained past honesty, and a shadow had walked in obedience to it. Latimer remained possible, and Cross nearer than she allowed, the chaplain too, with pastoral neutrality that resembles permission. I poured a whiskey and did not finish it. Rain counted the sash-like attendance. The lamp continued its mild deceit. Confession without crime, I wrote in my notebook, and waited for the room to disagree. It did not. I closed the book and listened to the corridor settle, wood remembering nameless footsteps. In the quiet, I saw again the head incline beneath a hood, the turn toward a window that refused to move, and felt the old ache of wanting to accept a tidy story and being saved at the last moment by the stubbornness of a shadow. The will turned up where such things vanish, a manila envelope inside another, behind tired returns and a receipt for a kettle. Lewis set it down with the satisfaction of a hinge. Recent, he said, the solicitor's letter carried this month. Anna had left a little, books named with care, a necklace without history, the residue of a small account, and one clause that had learned a new trick. a bequest once addressed to her father, no. I took out a lens and pretended magnification might summon honesty. 3 words had been gentled from their posts. The ink darkened where the nib hesitated, then pressed harder, as if burying doubt. The loop of the H, the narrow back of the R, a hand almost too composed. I thought of Cross and her marginalia in Milton, graphite rubbed and retraced with schoolmistress patience. Similarity is not identity. Resemblance is how shadows audition for substance. We walked the paper to St. Margaret's. Cross received us in a room smelling of chalk. She began before we asked. Protecting a vulnerable young woman is sometimes a tutor's duty, even when gratitude fails to file the proper forms. I let the page lie between us. She looked without blinking. The original wording, she said, had suffered from ambiguity. Fairness dislikes clumsiness. Anna wanted a friend cared for discreetly, without domestic litigation, and had sought advice. Lewis, careful with precision, asked whether advice often leaves a fingerprint. Cross smiled with the fatigue of the conscientious. She had suggested phrasing in draft. The solicitor had typed it later. She held suggested and draft in the air. Protection, she repeated, and the room seemed to nod. I studied the signature's neighborhood. Ink had bled into fibers troubled by erasure. Along the margin a black dot shone like a small eclipse where a nib had rested too long. Clerks avoid such intimacy. The alteration sat closer to the name than etiquette permits. Cross said Anna did not trust her father with confidences or money, familiar ground. Daughters disappointed by men who signed checks instead of sentences. The friend required discretion. She did not say Clara nor Chaplin. She set the noun down and let us furnish it. I saw the photograph in Milton, Clara's head on Anna's temple, and Brooke pouring sympathy like altar wine. If Cross protected anyone, perhaps it was an arrangement that preferred darkness to... The solicitor's stamp gave an honest date. The ink's greed suggested nocturnal attention. I recalled the porter's complaint about stair lamps extended past bedtime, the ledger that placed Cross moving through corridors at awkward hours. False light again, rooms prolonged beyond innocence, so that words might be persuaded into virtue. At the station I compared the clause to Cross's handouts. The R remained ascetic, the F slightly too tall. The tail of the Y refused ornament, preferring a clean descent. Lewis asked if I would call it forgery. I said I would call it care, the sort that improves another's text until it no longer belongs to them. He said juries prefer stronger nouns. I considered the choreography of prepositions that rule our lives. From 2-4, 3 small steps and an inheritance crosses the floor to sit beside another chair. Words are nimble servants. They also learn to pilfer. Anna's voice, dispersed among diaries, a crossword, a half-burned letter, now found itself ventriloquized by a tutor who loves clarity more than permission. When we left Cross, the corridor smelled of wax and weather, floorboards practicing their memories. I pictured the will beneath a lamp that pretended to be mourning, the nib hovering, the correction undertaken with the confidence of someone who believes form can absolve intention. Perhaps she meant kindness. Perhaps kindness borrowed the oldest alibi, secrecy. Ink dries. Its shadow persists longer than the stroke that made it. And somewhere, light waited to be turned off on duty. Hardy arrived first when the living borrow the dead. I sat with the college edition open. Helena had said she disappeared like a shadow at dawn. The page refused her. Hardy's shadow stays longer than the body. It lingers, an afterimage more loyal than flesh. The correction felt less pedantry than a key returned to the right lock. I walked the quadrangle that had nursed my first unease. Rain rehearsed on stone, the lamps kept their catechism. The night I watched that figure cross the flags, I had noticed only the insolence of absence. Now the line behaved like a summons. If a shadow can outlive its owner, what I saw belonged to arrangement rather than survival. The college understands arranged light. Lewis found me in the lodge where the porter's book preserves small sacraments. Pathology had altered its mind. Time of death disagreed with the newspaper's tidy hour, and quietly with the chaplain's memory of a lamp that never failed. The body, he said, had been cooler than the flat allowed. I said the sum begins like this, a life ends. The college continues it with lamps. We went to the east corridor where the stained glass advertises grace. The nick in the sill signed itself beneath my fingertip. From that corner, two things are plain: the library door and the stair where a hood might pause to measure obedience. If someone wished to extend the impression of life, the route would be short, the rehearsal quick, the audience carefully imprecise. Who tends light? Porters, yes, but also tutors who prefer order to truth. Helena had lobbied for stair bulbs to burn late when study required leniency. She could request a lamp in Anna's stair remain faithful after hours, and no one would quarrel with her virtue. Beneath such mercy a figure might cross, head tilted toward a window where no hand would answer, and the porter, glancing up from his crossword, would certify vitality without intending it. The will's corrected tale returned to me, that dot of ink like a held breath. Protection, Helena had said, and perhaps she believed it. She protected a narrative, the loyal scholar watching over a fragile talent, the college untainted by scandal, the friend cared for discreetly. Staging asks for little movement, a lamp extended, a cloak borrowed, a walk at the hour chosen for an eye already taught what to notice. The Times yielded its sting. Reflected light, the clue insisted. Reflected, not generated, the sort that flatters the dead by posing as their continuation. I remembered the neighbour's phrase about Sunday, that decisive tread on wood. Decision is a tutor's specialty, grief a student's. I asked Lewis for the key to the chapel vestry. Linen and old brass supplied their odour. On a shelf, beneath a box of hymn numbers, lay a roll of black serge, the weight of a gown. It was returned, with the conscience of someone who believes in tidy endings. I held the fabric and saw again the turn of the hood, the courtesy to an empty window, the obedience of stone. We confronted no one. Instead, we watched corridors behave. A lamp that should have slept remained dutiful. A porter who should have locked early lingered with tea. Helena's door breathed pedantry and lavender. When she passed us later, her glance touched the lamps, not us, as if confirming her instruments. The arithmetic settled. Anna had died earlier, elsewhere, in a room whose temperature told fewer lies. Her body stayed away while her custom continued. Her shadow, obediently arranged, walked once more for the college's peace of mind. I could hear Helena saying she had protected a vulnerable mind from gossip, that charity sometimes requires scenery. The misquote betrayed her wish that shadows vanish, that morning absolve. But Hardy would not bow. The shadow remained, longer than the body. Lewis asked what next. We gather the paper, I said, and let ink do what light has done. Dusk came. I closed the book on Hardy and left the lamp burning a minute too long to remember how easily a life can be prolonged by people who love neatness more than truth. Lewis and I sat in the SCR after the dons had retreated to their silences. The fire gave only gestures of heat, and the curtains had been drawn too early, the way some people draw conclusions. He waited with that loyalty of his, letting me uncurl the thread as if I were reluctant to part with it. Perhaps I was. Helena wrote the words, I said. Not Anna. The will was hers in intention if not in hand. The ink bore her cadence, the pause where a conscientious tutor corrects, the firmness of a woman accustomed to rules. She wished to shift legacy, not merely money. Anna's life must be remembered with Cross's annotation still attached. Pride is patient, but possession is hungrier. Lewis frowned into his glass. And the timing. Pathology was right, I told him. Anna was gone earlier, days perhaps. Helena needed a body elsewhere until the college had rehearsed its innocence. She borrowed time with lamps, with small gestures. Anna's shadow continued, while Anna herself had no more need of rooms. He looked at me as though waiting for proof that shadows have signatures. I told him of that night in the quadrangle, the figure I thought hers. The tilt of the head, the slow turning toward the window. Clara beneath the cloak, obedient to Cross's staging. Helena had pressed her into service, promising loyalty to memory, if not to truth. The porter, glancing from his crossword, would see only what Helena needed him to see. Presence extended, light, certified. Lewis muttered about loyalty gone sour. I answered that Helena's loyalty was the sort that corrects poets, that forges wills in order to save reputations, that prolongs a student's life with a lamp because endings felt untidy. She believed she was custodian of Anna's brilliance, and that brilliance required arranging. The crossword on my desk that morning had asked for Illusion's twin 6 letters. Mirage had fit easily, but the clue's trick had been the word legacy hidden backwards in the sentence, a setter's flourish, unnoticed at first. Legacies are written backward, I said to Lewis. The dead do not draft them, the living do. Helena drafted Anna's, literally and otherwise. He asked whether Clara had confessed. I said Clara's confession had been rehearsed by Helena long before. Depression, exile, farewell. The neat sentences Helena preferred. Clara borrowed them the way she borrowed Anna's cloak. The words carried Cross's discipline more than Clara's sorrow. Outside, rain applied itself again to stone, steady as handwriting. I told Lewis the motive was never money, nor concealment of crime in the vulgar sense. It was pride. A need to possess Anna, not as lover, not as ward, but as text one Cross had edited until her student's life became her own marginal note. Even the forgery bore the same instinct, correction disguised as kindness. He asked whether we could prove it. Proof is a blunt instrument, I replied. What we have is arrangement, shadows extended, wills rewritten, friends costumed, and yet the arrangement reveals its maker as surely as a misquoted line. Helena wanted shadows to vanish at dawn, but Hardy knew better. They linger longer than the bodies that cast them. We left the SCR quietly, chairs still angled as if listening. The porter dozed at his desk, the crossword abandoned mid-clue. A word unfinished, a life rewritten. I walked past the quadrangle where shadows still rehearsed, and thought again how easily absence can be dressed, and how pride, once disguised as protection, becomes its own author of death. Lewis said nothing more, and neither did I. Some explanations sound truer when left unfinished. The chapel keeps its own weather. Even when rain resigns outside, a fine dust hangs in the light, as if hymns had been powdered for storage. I sat near the back where stone remembers fewer names. A small choir warmed vowels beyond the screen. The organ tested a lean registration and accepted it. Lewis waited in the aisle with the manners of a man who has outgrown impatience. One of us should go home and make an honest meal. He muttered that my meals were deceits by habit, and I accepted the charge. He said Helena would not object when the paper was read to her. Objecting would be an aesthetic failure. I agreed too quickly, and he knew it. Candles eked out their work. I could smell altar linen, a faint shore of soap, and beneath it the older odour churches keep, iron and polish. Pride had worn each fragrance. Pride borrows benevolence and rearranges furniture. Anna's shadow will go on a while. A name tucked in prayers. A story repeated in the SCR with edges filed smooth. Clara will learn to keep her days unremarkable. Latimer will play something too long for anyone listening. The chaplain will wait at his desk for penitents and be awarded donors. As for Helena, distinction will survive the reprimand, but her sentences will grow careful to the point of airlessness. A motet found shape, the altos shouldering the line where the others tired. I remembered a different voice, one I never quite heard, belonging to a woman I might have loved if I had believed in better timing. I rehearsed that conversation in several rooms. Each time the first sentence failed. I wanted an honesty not shored by metaphor, yet all I had were metaphors. Work teaches thrift, What one saves in caution is paid for years later at a counter no clerk can find. Lewis shifted, glanced toward the door, then back to me. He had promised not to hurry and was keeping the promise with effort. He asked whether I believed Clara had known the theatre of it. I said she knew enough to feel necessary. And that is a narcotic, stronger than love. He asked whether Helena had loved the girl. I said love is often a first draft written in the hand of possession. He looked at the candles with a muted sympathy and said we should be going. Outside, evening decided on drizzle again. The porch trapped wet stone and extinguished matches. Students crossed the quad under inadequate umbrellas, each moving shadow rehearsing a life that would not quite turn. In the porter's window, a crossword lay face down, which is how small truths nap. I thought of the first night, that obedient figure passing under the lamps as if daylight were merely mislaid. Oxford loves theatre more than accuracy. A bell answered the motet with one plain note. I have never liked endings, only closures that behave well in public. We would file the papers, and the college would alter its lighting policy, and a caretaker would one day replace the bulb in the east corridor and notice brighter dust. I would keep the letter that stopped mid-sentence and the photograph with bruised corners. They would live in a drawer that briefly smells of whiskey when opened. Lewis cleared his throat, the sound of rain reconsidering a roof. He asked if I was all right. I told him, all right is a phrase for registries and weather reports. He said he would be in the car, not starting it yet. I watched him go and thought how loyalty in a plain suit is the last respectable extravagance. The choir fell silent, as if folded. I stayed until the wicks guttered and the organ sighed itself smaller. Pride, love, and the little economies we call mercy had staged their scenes upon stone. Shadows had done their patient work, outlasting the flesh, outlasting sense. I stood in the half-light and felt the old argument begin again, the one about truth and kindness, and which of them the living can bear. Morse lowered his eyes and saw only his own shadow lengthening in the candlelight.